In firearms analysis, examiners attempt to determine whether ammunition is or is not associated with a specific firearm based on tool marks produced by guns on the ammunition. The discipline is based on the idea that tool marks produced by different firearms vary substantially enough to allow components of fired cartridges to be identified with a particular firearm. However, sufficient studies have not been done to understand the reliability and reproducibility of the methods. That is, the foundational validity of the field has not been established. The bullet allegedly found at Richard Allen's house and matched to an unspent round at the crime scene is one of the main pieces of evidence in the case against Richard Allen.
First, ballistics evidence. State police tested a gun found in Richard Allen's home and compared that to an unspent bullet found between the two victims. The defense is questioning the science behind that testing.
It's important to question results when you receive them. Make sure you understand what it is that you're looking at.
And I think reminds us that sometimes we overstate the exactness that science offers in the way of telling us what's right and what's wrong.
Okay. So I kind of wanted to delve into this deeper. First off, we are going to learn a little bit about the science and the problems with that. And then I also wanted to mention here that this ballistics was processed within 5 days. And so that turnover time is extremely fast. And with ballistics being subjective in nature, these biases can have a real effect on the examiner. And when something is put forward as a rush for a police officer or in a case, then those ballistics examiners know that this is an important piece of evidence and they know that the cops want this to match. And with that quick turnover time, that doesn't necessarily give time for quality checks and assurance. And so this just raises a lot of questions in my mind about how carefully this was done. And I wanted to try to educate people on how much weight we put towards ballistic evidence in the first place. And then at the very end of this video, I'll go into like the actual parts of the gun and show a little bit more detail about like the actual examination and what we're looking at. So,
are you a real cop?
Freeze! What is that? Well. It looks like an illegal firearm. Or is it?
Oh. I don't know what this is. I'm sorry.
So
like a card.
Hopefully you'll come along with me. Sorry, this is kind of a long video, but I don't know how to edit very well, so here we go.
The main question that we should be asking is, what is the evidence that shows us that people in this field reach accurate results? It's not rocket science.
Forensic scientists can have protocols and guidelines, use well-accepted tools and technology, but we won't know if their methods are actually reliable until we have what's called an error rate study.
It's so absurd. Tarot card readers have a very complex, ancient methodology. It doesn't mean that they can tell your fortune.
Beginning, which is precedent somehow trumps science with respect to some areas, and some of it is a disincentive to challenge.
The field of firearms forensics is flawed. The matching of bullets to guns is subjective, and courts are starting to question it because of testimony from scientific experts. Forensic experts continue to employ unproven techniques, and courts continue to accept their testimony largely unchecked. However, courts have recently begun to recognize the scientific limitations of one forensic field, firearms identification, in which an examiner visually compares fired bullets or cartridge cases and opines on whether the items were fired by the same gun. Contrary to its popular reputation, firearms identification is a field built largely on smoke and mirrors. Firearms examiners suffer from what might be called Sherlock Holmes syndrome. They claim that they can match a cartridge case or bullet to a specific gun and thus solve a case. Science is not on their side, however. Few studies of firearms exist, and those that do indicate that examiners cannot reliably determine whether bullets or cartridges were fired by a particular gun. Firearms identification, like all purportedly scientific proof, must adhere to consistent and evidence-based standards. Fundamental justice requires no less. Absent such standards, the likelihood of convicting the innocent and thus letting the guilty go free is too great. It is perhaps this realization that has led courts to slowly start taking notice and restrict firearms testimony. In the courts, firearms examiners present themselves as experts. Indeed, they do possess the expertise of a practitioner in the application of forensic techniques, much as a physician is a practitioner of medical tools, such as drugs or vaccines. But there is a key distinction between this form of expertise and that of a researcher, who is professionally trained in experimental design, statistics, and scientific method, who manipulates inputs and measures outputs to confirm that the techniques are valid. Both forms of expertise have value, but for different purposes. Unfortunately, courts have rarely heard testimony from classically trained research scientists who could verify claims made by firearms examiners and explain basic principles and methods of science. Only research scientists have the wherewithal to counter the claims of practitioner experts. What are needed are anti-expert experts. Such guidelines from the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners allow examiners to declare a match between a bullet or cartridge case and a particular firearm, when the unique surface contours of two tool marks are in sufficient agreement. In other words, the criteria for the life-shaping decisions is based not on quantitative standards, but on the examiner's subjective experience. The NRC and the PCAST reports were attacked vigorously by firearms examiners. Although the reports per se had little impact on the judicial rulings, they did inspire additional tests of firearms identification accuracy. These studies report amazingly low error rates, typically around 1% or less, which emboldens examiners to testify that their methodology is nearly infallible. But how the studies arrived at these error rates is dubious, and without anti-expert experts to explain why these studies are flawed, courts and juries can and have been bamboozled into accepting suspicious claims.
A litany of flaws. In the case of firearms examination, establishing scientific validity turned out to be problematic. The central issue, Rosenblum explains, is that firearm examiners claim to be able to determine whether the bullets found at a crime scene were fired from one particular gun and no other. Doing so, however, presupposes that every gun imprints a set of unique physical characteristics on bullets and cartridge casings during the firing process. Yet, as Rosenblum discovered, the notion that every single gun has a signature distinct from every other gun has not been established scientifically, nor has the ability of firearm examiners to reliably and accurately say that a bullet was fired from one gun to the exclusion of all others. There have been many studies of this, but each one is lacking in at least one important aspect. Rosenblum turned up a litany of flaws in the studies that prosecutors and ballistics experts use to support the practice. These range from inadequate sample sizes, most studies involve 30 to 40 guns, whereas the total number of firearms circulating the U.S. is estimated at approximately 400 million, to a lack of transparency and peer review. Most have been published in trade journals, and data are rarely shared. It's not a real test. Perhaps the most troubling issue had to do with the calculation of error rates, which indicate the likelihood that an examiner will correctly conclude that a bullet did or did not come from a particular gun. Current validation studies, most of which were conducted by forensic firearms experts themselves, report error rates ranging from 0 to 11.3%. In their simplest form, these studies involve presenting examiners with a pair of bullets that have been fired under laboratory conditions from various guns, and asking them to determine whether the bullets came from the same gun or from different guns. But Rosenblum points out, the manner in which most validation studies have been conducted means that the true error rate remains unknown. For example, the examiners who participate in such studies are typically permitted to reach 3 different conclusions. The 2 bullets were not fired from the same gun, exclusion, they were fired from the same gun, identification, or they can't tell, inconclusive. An inconclusive finding, Rosenblum says, clearly means that the examiner didn't reach the correct answer, since every pair of bullets must have been fired either from the same gun or from different guns. Yet most validation studies count inconclusives as correct or exclude them entirely. Rosenblum compares the situation to one in which students taking the SAT were allowed to skip any question they couldn't answer. It's not a real test. Everyone will get a perfect score, he says. Indeed, when inconclusives are counted as incorrect, error rates suddenly climb as high as 93%. What's more, one of the best designed studies, known as AIMS-2, revealed that firearms examiners often reach different conclusions when presented with the same sets of bullets in several rounds of testing. Different firearms examiners, meanwhile, disagree with one another's conclusions 32% to 69% of the time. When questioned about the Ames 2 study, Hamby professed not to know that it had in fact been designed to measure not only accuracy but also repeatability and reproducibility. Firearm Forensics, Future. Given these shortcomings, Rosenblum says he doesn't see how firearms examination could be used as a reliable source of evidence in a criminal trial, though he has begun.
The most telling findings came from subsequent phases of the Ames 2 study, in which researchers sent the same items back to the same examiner to reevaluate and then to different examiners to see whether results could be repeated by the same examiner or reproduced by another. The findings were shocking. The same examiner looking at the same bullets a second time reached the same conclusion only 2/3 of the time. Different examiners looking at the same bullets reached the same conclusion less than 1/3 of the time. So much for getting a second opinion. And yet firearms examiners continue to appear in court claiming that studies of firearms identification demonstrate an exceedingly low error rate. The English biologist Thomas Huxley famously said, "Science is nothing but trained and organized common sense." In most contexts, judges display an uncommon degree of common sense. However, when it comes to translating science for courtroom use, judges need the help of scientists. But this help must come not just in the form of scientific reports and published articles. Scientists are needed in the courtroom. Extractor and ejector marks on unspent rounds cycled through guns may not be unique. These marks are typically created by the interaction between the extractor and ejector mechanisms in the firearm with the cartridge case. While these marks can provide valuable forensic evidence, they may not be distinct enough to definitively link a specific round to a particular firearm model or assembly line. The marks left by the extractor and ejectors are common across various firearms and can vary based on factors like the design of the gun and the condition of its components. Therefore, while these marks can indicate that a round has been cycled through a gun, they may not be exclusive identifiers of a specific firearm's origin.
So the machine we're looking at here is called brass tracks, and it's used to photograph the markings on the head of the cartridge case. We're going to take photographs of the breech face marks on the primer. We're going to do a close-up of the firing pin impression as well, and we're also going to do a close-up of the ejector mark on the side. On this cartridge case, you've got the silver disc on the back of it. We're going to do some photographs of that silver disc, the primer, so we'll do that right now. What it's going to do now is what we call the full head stamp. It's going to take a series of 9 photographs, which it will then reconstruct into one giant image that's got the entire head of the cartridge case in one giant photo. So what we're looking at now is a close-up of the breech face information. All the striations that were marked on that breech face that was photographed, we're able to look at them side by side and move the hairline back and forth to see how much is common between the reference exhibit and the test one. Here's your reference. This is the guy that was the standard during the correlation, and this is a guy that was in the database that came up as the best potential match. And already the naked eye, you've got a lot of similarities here with the within the shear marks, also the striations on the surface. You can see with the ring light image that we're looking at, there's some common details between the two. So what we're going to look at now is the correlation results for the bullet score. So what we want to do now is see how much common information there is between these two exhibits by sliding them together and also by moving that hairline back and forth. So what the tracks machines are enabling firearms examiners.
Here it is going to eject the casing. The red thing is the ejector. So the extractor grips onto the ledge of the bullet or cartridge, and it hooks the casing rim, and then the casing hits the ejector and it flips it right off of there. So I'd like everybody to take note that these are less likely to create those striated marks, and so they would be more like impression marks. There's literally like nothing to say how many guns that are the same gun would leave those same impression marks.
I think many judges are more skeptical of evidence presented by the criminal defense side. I had been a criminal defense lawyer. I did not have that. I didn't see that in the same way. But prosecutors' experts are oftentimes, the prosecutor is a repeat player in the courtroom. The prosecutor is much better funded. And so oftentimes the balance is just the opposite, where a judge would be more skeptical of defense experts. Shouldn't be, but oftentimes, oftentimes is.
In the 1930s. And most of the forensic science disciplines in use today did not originate in the scientific, say, academic field, DNA being the one of a couple of exceptions. But generally, they were created specifically for use by law enforcement in criminal cases. And as a result, they unfortunately skipped the scientific validation process that is typically required in the use of any other kind of science. And they also knew that most people, lay people, wouldn't have the same kind of expertise. So an expert could come in, have sort of the lab coat phenomenon that jurors would tend to defer to the opinions that the experts would present. And the analyst then testifies and is supposed to give an opinion about whether the hair might be similar to or consistent with, but the science was never good enough that they could have or should have said that it was a match, although unfortunately it was misused that way all too often. Tool marks and ballistics, whether a bullet came from a gun, and when people then go back and look at the proven wrongful convictions, or what you would call miscarriage of justice in the UK, as many as 50% of them had flawed or wrong forensic evidence. That is to say, forensic evidence that pointed to them or was maybe misused, and experts actually said that it was a match with the defendant, when in fact DNA later proved that was completely wrong.
The requirement for establishing qualifications, sufficient facts, reliable methodology, reliably applied, is preponderance, more likely than not. Now that's 51%, just slightly better than a coin toss. So the bar that you have to clear, while it does require that you meet these reliability factors, ultimately that has to be shown by the proponent by a preponderance. And so that will still make it possible to have evidence by prosecutors that is subject to cross-examination and challenge, but meets the minimum test for being heard by the jury. And then, of course, the obligation is for the defense to meet it when they can meet it. This can create resource problems. Some of the cases.
Research database. So anyone familiar with pattern evidence knows that it is subjective in nature, right? As of right now, we are unable to provide a probability or a likelihood ratio or any type of quantitative mathematical based weight to an identification or to a finding. I don't know how close we are, but there's a lot of work that's being done in the last 8 years or so. I really think within hopefully maybe the next 5 years, we'll be able to provide some type of weight in the likelihood of identifications. And then there's CSAFE, who also was developing automatic matching algorithms, also for the purpose of trying to provide objective assessment of pattern evidence, okay, which again would be quantitative versus subjective or qualitative. And their projects right now include the statistical algorithmic approaches to matching bullets and cartridges, the effects of subclass characteristics on cartridge case comparisons, and then evaluating the foundational validity of tool mark analysis, again, meaning do tools produce different tool marks? And how can this help you in conviction integrity cases? So there's a couple things to really point out. Quality forensic laboratories seek the truth, okay? Everyone in the forensic, I don't want to say everyone, I could say that forensic scientists are working to provide you answers to the evidence that they examine, okay? Those answers should not be skewed or tilted or driven towards one side or the other, okay? And therefore, the forensic laboratory should accommodate reasonable requests for reexamination and testing. I emphasize reasonable because if you were to say, ask a laboratory to microscopically compare the evidence on your case with every other shooting incident that happened in their jurisdiction, right? That's not feasible and therefore not reasonable. However, to ask for evidence on your case to be re-examined by a new firearms examiner, again, if it's an accredited lab, under laboratory accreditation, right, with the reliability of equipment and methodology and operating procedures, the laboratory should accommodate that request.
Thing that the firearm examiner will look for when they're doing a test fire and comparing it, they look for what class is it. And if they can eliminate right from the get-go, if it's a different class, they say, we're done with that examination, we'll go to the next thing. The second part you hear is subclass characteristics, and there may be inadvertent or accidental marks that are made across a batch or batches of firearm. Well, you may have a two-mark expert looking when they do the comparison microscope, and they may call that an individual characteristic when yet they don't know how many guns have that same exact marking. If the expert can't say that this is definitively an individual characteristic, it may be a subclass characteristic. With ballistics, you have to understand, how does a gun work?
I did have it racked, but I unloaded it. So, New York 10-round mags, woohoo! Awesome. We'll do a quick breakdown of this. For a quick disassembly. Now, don't get mad at me. It is dirty. I have been using it. So you just open her up. Turn this little lever. That's one thing I like about these SIGs. They're just so easy to take down. Boom. So supposedly, not that I care. Excuse my French. So put it back to lock. Switch it there. Function check. She's all together. Now this model also has a decocker on it, which I love SIG decockers. They're so quiet. That's it. My HKs are like smack. You think it's going off or something, but it's not. There's your slide release. Like I said, your takedown lever. This does have tritium sights. I'll show you the trigger. Just check again. Check, 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 triple check. So the trigger pull on this, there's the wall right there. It's just that much take up, and it's super clean brake. Super clean. Now, I'll show you the reset. Let's see if I can get... Okay, got a little target set up down there. 15 yards. Now I'm shooting 165 grain Winchester. Just a white box, the regular stuff. Let's see how I do. Just get warmed up. All right.
So after a round is fired, the job of the extractor and ejector is to remove the now empty brass casing that is in the chamber in order to load the next round. The extractor is basically a hook, which is right here, that hooks on to the back edge of the brass casing. And that looks like this. The hook is hooked into the notch in the back of the brass casing. When the slide retracts, it can pull that brass casing or extract it right out of the chamber. And then the ejector comes into play. As the slide continues to move back, the ejector, which is here, it pushes the brass casing and ejects it right out of the gun. Just a couple other examples of what it looks like. Here is a 1911, and this is the extractor. It's got the little hook on it, and here is the ejector. All right, here is a Glock 17, and here is the extractor, and here is the rather aggressive ejector in this gun. One more example, I have a Springfield XDM here, and once again the extractor is over here, the hook, and the ejector, just to show you on the Springfield how they're mounted. The ejector is almost always mounted right on the frame, and that's stationary. So it's when the slide moves back, the ejector is in the groove, and the ejector slides up and pushes out the brass. So if we look right here, there's a dummy round I have in here, and what happens when this gets loaded, the slide comes forward, and you'll see what happens. The round is forced up, and the extractor hooks on to the rear of the brass right here. It's grabbed onto the little piece right there, so it's got a hold of that piece of brass. When the gun is fired,
the slide goes backward, pulls that brass out with it, and then when it goes all the way back, it hits the ejector, which flips it out of the gun. And then it grabs onto the new round and does the same thing. So that's how it works. So here's a picture of a dummy round is sitting in the gun. It is being held in by the extractor, as you can see there. And what happens is on this gun, this is the ejector, this piece of metal that sticks up right here. Usually it's mounted to the frame, and when the slide goes backward, it rams this side of this brass into this ejector, and it kind of catapults it or ejects it right out of the gun. And I'll show you that in slow motion.
Striated action marks are common to cartridge cases that have passed through the action of an auto-loading or repeating firearm. Striated action marks can be produced on cartridge casings by contact with a number of different areas within the firearm. Some of the more common striated action marks include chamber marks, shear marks, firing pin drag marks, extractor marks, and ejector marks. So chamber marks are one of the most common striated action marks. Roughness in the chamber of a firearm can scratch the outer walls of a cartridge case when loaded and removed from the chamber. Most chamber marks occur after the cartridge is fired. Cartridge cases expand when fired, pressing out against the walls of the chamber. When they are pulled out of the chamber, the sides of the cartridge case can be scratched. The comparison image below shows the chamber marks on a .22 caliber rimfire cartridge cases. Another common striated action mark are shear marks, produced by Glock pistols on cartridge case primers. Glock pistols have a rectangular firing pinhole below in their breech face. When a cartridge case is forced backwards from recoil, the primer embeds itself in the firing pinhole. As the slide of a pistol starts to recoil, the barrel will drop slightly as the action opens. The dropping barrel forces the cartridge case to move down slightly, and when this happens, the lower edge of the embedded primer is sheared downward and out of the firing pinhole. The resulting striated marks can be seen in the comparison image below. Firing pin drag marks. In a similar process, striated marks called firing pin drag marks can be produced. When the firing pin springs forward to strike the primer of a cartridge, it may remain slightly forward and embed in the primer. Certain barrels, like in the Glock, drop down slightly as recoil is forcing the action open. The cartridge case drops with the barrel causing the nose of the protruding firing pin to drag across the primer as it leaves the firing pin impression. The below comparison image shows firing pin drag marks produced by a Colt 45 auto pistol. Extractor marks. Another action mark usually found in a striated form are those created by the extractor of most auto-loading or repeating firearms. The extractor is a small part, sometimes resembling a hook, that is used to remove a cartridge or cartridge case from the chamber of a firearm. The image below shows the extractor of a 9mm Glock pistol hooked into the extractor groove of a cartridge. As the slide of the pistol moves to the rear, the extractor pulls the cartridge case along with it until it is ejected from the pistol. The extractor may or may not leave identifiable mark on the cartridge case. This is true if the cartridge is fired or simply hand-chambered and extracted without firing. Extractor marks may look like those seen in the comparison image below. Ejector marks. As described above, the extractor pulls the cartridge case out of the firearm's chamber. As the cartridge case is pulled to the rear, it will be struck somewhere on an opposing edge by a part seen below called the ejector. The ejector is designed to expel the cartridge case from the action of the firearm. The resulting impact of the cartridge case with the ejector will cause another action mark that can be used as means of identification. Ejector marks can be striated in nature, but a lot of the time they are impressed action marks.